let's welcome Neil to come forward and talk.
Neil Greenberg, Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology, retired 10 years ago. Instead of being a professor, I'm now what they call a professor emeritus, which doesn't change much except I can teach what I want when I want, and it's this. I do it every spring. And I look forward to it enormously. This next spring will be the 41st time I've done it. Maybe 47. But I swear it has never gotten stale because I bring whatever I've got at the moment, which is kind of cumulative, to a couple of dozen, well now I'm limiting it to 18 actually to have a good intimate conversation. Undergraduates and graduate students both. You can take a course for graduate credit at UT. So after, how fast can I go through the last 50 years? Came out of Drew University, saturated with very radical Methodism. There's a big seminary there and a lot of hotshot theologians, but they had a good liberal art campus, and it worked out, so I was in an extremely nice atmosphere to get a little touch of everything, plus a couple of great biologists. And it was a commute out of New York City, although I chose to live near the college instead. It's in the middle of New Jersey. From that to Rutgers University, where I was able to latch onto an opening institute, some hotshot in the physiology of behavior, got a vast grant and opened the whole institute at Rutgers, and it combined psychology and zoology. So, I mean, the die was cast, so there I go. I mean, I was ambivalent about being born, my mother tells me. So, you know, I've always had a lot of things to think about, and kind of let decisions occur on their own, that paths open up on their own. And so after a degree in what's called, at that time, kind of a new field called ethology, which is the science of behavior in a naturalistic context, emphasis on ecology and evolution. And I was looking at the behavior of reptiles, because I thought that would be the simplest animal to look at, that has some basic similarities to things I was interested in humans. My mother kept saying, why don't you go to medical school? No, this is what I want to do, Mom. And I did it. But my brain being my weird brain, one thing led to another, and looking at reptiles and understanding a lot about their behavioral ecology made me think about how are their senses operating in this system? And why do they seem to be changing? So what every graduate student does near the end of their career is wander around wherever they might want to, prospects for a job, give a seminar, and I went, fortunately, to one seminar where somebody from National Institute of Mental Health heard me and said, you like reptiles, we're interested in psychology and mental health, and why don't you give a talk for us, like you just did for, I think this last was at the American Museum in New York City. And I did. I went to Washington, gave a talk, and I forgot all about it. And about 6 months later, saying, how'd you come to Washington? So the next 5 years at the National Institute of Health, where I did neurology, which, I mean, how do organisms get to know what they know? How do they get to do what they do? It all goes through the brain. It seemed very reasonable and rational to me. So I developed a reptile neurology section in the National Institute of Mental Health, at a place called the Laboratory of Brain Evolution and Behavior, which was run by a guy named Paul D. MacLean. A lot of people don't know him. Some people recognize a concept he came up with called the Triune Brain, where he thought that reptiles kind of represented a primitive level of consciousness, and on that were imposed more sophisticated levels leading to humans. It's not a fashionable idea anymore. It's a little bit too simplistic, but it gave me the leverage I needed, and I learned everything I could possibly learn about the brains of reptiles from every possible direction. 5 years later, what are you going to do with the rest of your life, Neil? Well, I didn't want to do anything administrative, but Minnesota, Florida, and Tennessee were all kind of interested in, well, we might have a place for somebody with your interest, because we're looking to get cool and interdisciplinary. And you're from New York, and you know, that kind of stuff. And Tennessee made the best deal by far. God bless them. And I stayed there until I'm still there. All right, I taught in a new course called Ethology with Gordon Burkhardt. Some of you guys might know that name. He's a big shot in the psychology department, but also the same interdisciplinary biology interests I have. I'm also one of the world's experts on reptiles. He can talk sometime on the concept of play. He wrote the book on play in animals.
I believe he did come and talk about it.
Did he do that?
Yes.
Good, I'm glad.
That was about 2 years ago, 3 years ago.
Anyway, at the get-go, given a lot of freedom, I cultivated a connection with a section at the university called University Studies, which was deliberately and meant to be interdisciplinary. It went across all campuses, all departments, and it offered a bunch of courses, and I decided to offer this course, the Art and Science of Art and Science, to keep a kind of hand in on that. And that twiddled along for 10 or 15 years. I changed the name to what we have now. What's the name of it?
Art and Organism.
Because it better represented, I think, our department. But it didn't matter. I'm still teaching in both departments. The courses are cross-listed. I just heard today that ecology is filled to the gills, but the University Studies department, which has a place in the catalog, is still open. And a few students said that they might come today to get oriented and see if they might be interested. If they are, they would have to go through University Studies because their registry is not full yet. I hold it to a small number so we can have intimate discussions. And in a couple of minutes, you'll know why that intimacy is important. I like this picture, and it evokes a quote, and it did right away, about when ripples go on indefinitely. And Emerson said, our life is an apprenticeship to the truth, that around every circle another can be drawn. That there is no end in nature, but every end is a beginning, and under every deep, a lower deep opens. Beautiful. He was one of the great minds of transcendentalism in the 19th century. People like, who wrote one? And a half a dozen others. Okay, so lower deep opens. That's a very beautiful spiritual way of saying it's turtles all the way down. I don't know if you've ever heard that expression. But, oh well. Forgive these tangents, and I was told I have until 9 o'clock, is that right? No? All right, well, I'll trim it when I can. At a very elegant regal reception in London, a nice old lady who was not to be ignored came to ask Bertrand Russell, Mr. Russell, I enjoyed your talk about logic and rationality and all of that, but I understand that the world is really a kind of an illusion balanced on the back of a turtle. And I want to know, and I'm sure you're the guy that can tell me, sir, what's under the turtle? And then the expression was born, it's turtles all the way down. All the way down. I came to believe this. And this is what I still talked about teachers and learners, or students. So we may talk about students and registration and all of that for a class I might teach. But I've tried to get rid of that distinction. We're all participants now in this seminar. And I hope we're all participants here, and the questions you ask me will help me know that. I also appreciate that teaching and learning are creative acts, and they combine affect, all kinds of emotionality, and reason. It's not one or the other. And I've kind of made a mini career out of this in the last 5 or 6 years. I've been going to conventions, two international ones and several national ones, talking about the art and science of teaching, per se. And I've gotten enormous feedback from being amongst professional secondary or collegiate level pedagogues. Not teachers anymore, these people are pedagogues. They teach teaching. And I think I taught them something, and we'll talk about that a little bit. But they certainly taught me a lot about how to communicate with people who weren't really on my wavelength. Here's a poster David developed for us. I love how colorful it is, and it's absolutely complete in details, Kids Cafe, everything else. And here's another way of looking at Art and Organism. And I like this picture because it shows the cosmos. I think it's part of the Crab Nebula someplace. And it shows the brain. And both of these things are shown with aspects to them that, if we really did have till 9 o'clock, we could go off in 5 or 10 minutes on each of those. Like the horizontal, does this arrow show up on the screen? Yeah, it does. The horizontal and the vertical parts of the human cerebral cortex have slightly different functions, operate at slightly different levels of organization. Levels of organization can play big in our thinking. It's not intuitively doing that all the time. One of the things we're going to find out about is how to tweak our intuitions to accommodate that. So, horizontal, vertical, in neuroscience it's called top-down versus bottom-up cognition. Top-down means the brain is kind of telling you what to think. Bottom-up is it's coming in from your senses. And of course it gets combined someplace, and we'll talk about that. Because about halfway through my career at Tennessee, people started calling me, well, they call you what's convenient to try to identify you. I used to be called a herpetologist because I worked with reptiles. And then I published all this stuff in neurology journals, and I became a neurologist. And then I started thinking about thinking. And not just the kind of gross reflexes that I could document in my reptiles and sometimes in people, but at another level completely, where are some of the decisions about behavior being made? A lot of those decisions about behavior have to do with decisions that are made about what are you going to pay attention to. And each of those has their own cultural tradition, academic tradition, scholarly tradition, research tradition, and here I am trying to juggle all of that stuff. Okay, I'll tell you a quick story about juggling. 3 weeks ago, I got a letter from a former student, 12 years ago. It said, Greenberg, I keep expecting to come back to Tennessee and we have a beer and I'll tell you what happened after I took your class. And that's all he said in this letter, but thanks, it was a great experience. I wrote back and said, well, how was it a great experience? What happened to you? He said, well, as you know, I was pre-med and I was on a fast track to medical school. And I went to the Burning Man out in the Southwest and met my life's partner, and the two of us joined the circus. So I have a bona fide successful circus performer amongst my alumni, and he does juggling. And when I asked next time the circus comes to town, if I could sit in. All right, so here's our logo for the course. It's from the 14th century in principle, at least. It's showing a pilgrim, like we all are, on a path that suddenly made a breakthrough and discovered a new paradigm. And that's a lovely picture, and we can all identify with, we've all had insights and broken through into new ways of understanding. But in this case, this guy, who was there a second ago, those things exist simultaneously, and he was not yet able to see that. And I'm trying to rush things and get it so that we can see the two paradigms simultaneously. And it's a trick. It's like multitasking. And it really is a kind of a mental trick. And some people do it spontaneously and naturally, like my wife. And other people work hard at it and get there. And it's a powerful way to think about the world. So paradigms. We're talking about paradigms all the time and where they have boundaries. We're going to talk about our boundaries in a minute. But here's another picture I discovered of, in the background, that complicated business back here. It's about 60 feet high, 60 feet around. It's the looking down the snout of the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Switzerland, where they discovered, what was their big shot discovery 2 years ago?
The boson?
Yeah, that's where the boson was discovered, and they just got a $23 billion bump. I don't know where this is coming from. They're advertising their $23 billion bump to go deeper than the boson. About 15 years ago, the government of India gave them this sculpture. It's only about, this is like 60 or 70 feet. You can see the layers and the ladders go for the people who go in and work on it. This thing is only about 15 feet. Bronze, gorgeous. It is the Hindu god, not a pilgrim, but the Hindu god Shiva. And Shiva in his incarnation as not the Raja, nickname, a fond nickname for the young Shiva who danced the dance of the creation of the universe and the destruction of the universe in endless cycles. Now, because we really only have 2 hours, I'm going to ask you to try to hold the idea of creation of the universe and destruction of the universe someplace in the corner of your mind for a few minutes. Because it's complicated. All right, not a Raja, dance of becoming and going away. And what about art and science? Okay, so as a cognitive neurologist now, looking at the parts of the brain that are concerned with different cognitive functions, cognition is anything we want to say about input of information from your senses, tapping into information that's already stored in your brain, memory, short-term memory, medium, long-term memory, and ways you go about finding paths of action from all that's going into your brain to what's going on in the world. Frankly, it's behavior that is everything as far as we're concerned. Without behavior, what is it? What's going on? So their catchphrases, I think, for these constellations of cognitive functions. We can look coarsely, like I said, there's like maybe 6 or 8 cognitive functions you can just come up right off the top of your head. When you start looking at the things that different modules of the brain do in all kinds of species, but especially most conspicuously in humans, where we have a lot of data from diseases and surgery and strokes. We have a lot of precision about different parts of the brain, what they do in particular, what part they play in something cognitive. Sometimes something that we think of as a cognitive function like memory is actually about 12 things converging. The critical thing is they all converge in different proportions.
Can
So,
you give an example of that statement? Of different proportions, maybe pick up a couple of the extremes to make.
well, the way sometimes by birth, I'll call that congenital, sometimes by birth, we are selectively able to perceive some things more easily than others. I like that the capacity to do that was touched on by the guy in the little video before that could move around as though he could see, but he couldn't. He was totally blind. That got my attention when I learned about a guy who had a stroke that rendered him blind. And he was studied at Oxford because of the way the stroke hit his optical system. He could not report anything he saw, but he could walk across the floor, never bump into anything. He couldn't identify you, but he knew where everything was and what was going on. The guy that did the research in the 70s called that blind sight. And that is something that converges with what really dominates us, the stuff that comes through our retina. We call it normal sight. Well, that's there too. And sometimes you have a feeling of that's something you can't see, but you sort of feel it in the visual part of your mind. Maybe that's your imagination, or maybe it's something like blind sight.
So a phenomenon that I'm aware of is the most common example of the phenomenon that we might be familiar with is if you're on social media or Facebook, they'll send these puzzles through where the letters of a word are scrambled, except for the first and the last letter. And if you look at it, your brain immediately knows what it says, even though it's a jumbled mess of letters, because of the way the brain fills in what the senses don't provide. Or you'll see another puzzle where certain letters are missing, or there'll be
something called filling in.
You're filling in. And so if that in some way connects to the blind side, maybe we're doing that all the time, where we're getting only bits and pieces of information, our brain is filling that in.
Right, exactly, on target. We're all doing that all the time. We can't possibly have kind of recognition of everything we're seeing simultaneously. We take what's most relevant to us. So looking at a class of 60 eager undergraduates about to take ethology, I look around for who's frowning, who's like this, who's like this. I spot that stuff right away, and it really structures how I open my presentation. I open my presentation here in a very open way, not nearly as careful as I might in the classroom. Thank you. But that's a cognitive function of enormous importance that's just in the last 10 years been able to get actual empirical evidence about how filling in works. People fill in all the time, not what's there, but what ought to be there. Okay, another digression. In class, people learn to make notes about digressions on the side of their paper. But another digression is one of the gigantic jumps in ethology, the discipline of animal behavior I picked up on, was that at the time psychology was on a roll. The great psychologists were really not only making fortunes of Madison Avenue, knowing how to advertise to people, how to get their attention and hold it and persuade them of things, but there's a book by Nance Packard called The Hidden Persuaders. It was a big hit back in the 60s. Anyway, the 60s ethology came, and they didn't have this phrase for it. I just invented this phrase a couple of years ago when I got off on a tangent studying a dimension of human philosophy about human behavior called phenomenology. But that's another whole lecture. It's very interesting, but I realized that I've been doing for animals what phenomenologists do for human beings. They don't look at average human beings. They don't look at ideal human beings, they look at real human beings. They're not gonna look at a bell curve. It's like, no bell curve here. They look at you and your context, and it involves the real psychological study of it. It involves very close and very intimate interviews, almost like psychoanalysis. That's another thing to put on the side. We'll pick up psychoanalysis in a few minutes.
This thing about filling in is kind of interesting. Come January, my wife and I will have been married for 35 years. And what we found is we can say the same words in the same sentence and mean something totally different. So what I'm wondering is interpretation, a sort of fill-in, and what kinds of factors in a person's background or innate influence that difference in feelings.
It's what juggles and manages, balances all of those different cognitive functions. Is those slight differences from conception. I mean, some things that affect the brain and the way the brain operates are beginning at conception, and some of it's genetic. But the vast amount of it in our species, the way we've evolved to be highly protected for a few months and then go out into the real world where we're not so protected, and frankly, being protected for 9 months is pretty much unchanged for tens of millions of years. The environment's changing all the time. So you get both these kinds of information early on. Once you don't screw up early development with too many strange experiences, which we've learned about, maternal trauma in pregnancy can have effects that don't show up until 10 years later in the child. Bizarre kinds of things happen about the time of conception in the womb that were unpredictable until we had big numbers in the world. Big numbers are when we have documentation about the health of millions and millions of people. So you can look at big trends. And then if a researcher goes and looks at where do these numbers come from, for example, in Holland, about 15 years ago, they found out that men who have survived famine during World War II had a higher proportion of male offspring, and those male offspring had a higher probability, looking at these millions of numbers, higher probability of having some specific kinds of disorders. Some psychological, a lot of them physical, things like diabetes. And it was attributable to the effect of the trauma on the cells that generate sperm, so such that the genetics of the sperm are slightly different. Same thing happens to women. Once they had that, holy Moses, where did that come from? And everybody jumped all over it. They finally validated it. They were looking at everything then. All kinds of phenomena that occur before or during childbirth. And what are the long-term consequences? Made possible by looking at numbers and keeping track in the big national medical systems of people's progress over many years, decades even. So a lot of stuff's coming to light now that would have been utterly impossible, unthinkable, just 20 years ago before we started collecting those numbers. That's another cool tangent, but let me just say that overlapping configurations of cognitive functions, I hope you can appreciate the diversity of cognitive functions. Every sense we have has its own semi-dedicated pathway to a place where we can tap into it and act upon it. Some of it's very, very rapid, some of it's over a long period of time. Tell me if you have or haven't ever had the experience of something that meant nothing to you at the time, and maybe even 5 years later. During those 5 years, you never dreamed about it, thought about it. 5 years later, it pops up as something relevant in your life. It's not common, but in every class, there's 2 or 3 people that say, "How did you know about that? How did you know about that?" There's a certain number of people, and it sounds like I'm doing mind reading, because people say, "No, I'm the only person in the world that ever had that problem." I ask people, what are the prospects of when they used to fall asleep as children, if they were in their own bed, were they ever worried about their hand or arm hanging over the side? And about a third of the people said, "Yeah, I didn't want the monsters to grab me, the monsters under the bed to grab me, so I kept it in." I do that all the time. But they never dreamt that that was a very natural human phenomenon, and not universal. Don't know why it should not be universal. Maybe it's just tricks of memory. But I want to make the case that these cognitive functions are very diverse, and each one of them is like nested inside of other functions, which are nested inside of other functions. And these are all different levels of organization. I made some progress with a bunch of neurology colleagues at a recent convention, because I said, "You're studying this at the level of pyramidal cells in the 3rd layer of the cerebral cortex, and you're making generalizations about the hippocampus. What's going on here?" So it's all part of the brain. No, it's not. Each part of the brain has its own unique area. It's almost like a whole bunch of different organs. They have a few things in common. Maybe a lot of things in common, but they're not all the same. They're connected and they function slightly differently.
Has anybody applied chaos theory to this kind of?
Artificial intelligence guys are doing that now. They're trying to use chaos theory and a lot of sophisticated mathematics. There's a lot of people doing it, and there's a lot of money behind it, but it hasn't changed any paradigms yet. People are figuring there's just, all we need to do is work harder and we'll find out. It's not going to be a big change, like gravity was, or heliocentrism was. It won't be a big change like that. It'll be a real change like we just have more information.
I'm just curious if anybody else had a question they want to ask at this point.
I'm not so sure.
Did I tell you it was a deep subject or not?
It was.
No, there's something big coming, I'm sure. Only because that's the history of our species. Big things came. Okay, this is always grounded in biology. I am, by profession, my career, my paycheck, my reputation is all based in biology. We started there, and there is no way that you could think about any of those cognitive functions without considering that it meets a biological need. It's easy. I mean, you wouldn't do it if you didn't need it. Okay, now I will have a whole bunch of juniors and seniors in evolutionary theory in about the middle of January. And they say, "Whoa, wait a minute, Greenberg, wait a minute. Meets biological need. What's the need for this? There's no need for males having nipples. There's no need for an appendix." Well, go a little bit deeper in evolutionary biology and you'll find out that there was a need for it, and we wouldn't be here if we didn't need it 20 million years ago. We met that need, and our ancestors survived. We have a vestige of that. They're called vestigial now. But actually, every now and again, the appendix comes and saves someone's life, because it's a reservoir for the microbiome. And if you wipe your gut clean with a very heavy antibiotic, such that the microbiome is destroyed, you have all kinds of digestive and even cognitive problems for months, maybe years, unless you have a reservoir of your own microbiome which has been preserved in your appendix. It's hard to get to some places antibiotics have a real hard time getting. Anyway, that's one. So, yeah, it may not seem to have any purpose now, but that's a great question. Talk to your evolutionary biology professor. What need did that serve in the ancestral past of this species? Okay, what about art? One of the things I tried to say about art and science is overlapping functions. About art, I'm trusting this is there. Yeah, okay. It'd be funny if I was off on the tangent. You might take half an hour to notice. Somebody we know about in Knoxville, because there's a park named after him downtown, Crutch, said that even when it is at its most determinedly realistic, art is conceived in accordance with the laws and limitations of the human mind. Cognitive functions right there. It's like walking down a Las Vegas thing with lots of lights blinking at me. All these cognitive functions. Even the most desperately naturalistic art is at its most literal, nature passed through a human mind. So think about your mind and its cognitive functions as something through which nature passes, and at the other end comes your beliefs and your behaviors based on those beliefs. Emile Zola said exactly the same thing in the 19th century. One of his best buddies was Claude Bernard, who was the most famous physician-scientist of the 19th century. He wrote a book and started to develop the idea of homeostasis, that is the dynamic balance of all the organs within our body, that has organized medicine and medical research ever since. They were best buddies, and Zola picked up on something that Bernard said, same thing. Nature passed through the human mind. Longfellow said the same thing as a New England poet. You come to these insights from different directions. Now, at this point, I always make a major apology to everybody for saying, you said that, and then you said that, and then you said it again, and then you said it again. And we heard that, and I've got all the little pieces, all I have to do is put them together. But the fact is, every time you hear it, it's a little different. If I don't say it differently, you see it differently. When I go to the museum, every December I go to New York City, we do all the museums, I see old favorites. Oh, good to see you again, you know, whatever I'm looking at. And I see an old favorite and I see it in a completely new way. I have heard movie directors talking amongst themselves and sometimes publishing this, that a really great movie, novelists talk about it all the time, a really great novel, is one which you can keep dipping back into. It's exactly the same. Keep dipping back into it. You're different. It has a different meaning to you. So if I say something in 10 minutes that I just said 10 minutes ago, yeah, you've heard that all before. And if you were building a clock, you got all the little gears and mechanisms. But we're not building a clock. We're trying to build a mind. And no, we're trying to build an attitude. Okay, so what the hell were these people thinking 30,000 years ago when they painted those things on the walls in Spain? And there's some in France and rather all over the world, really. Although the ones in Europe are the most famous, Spain and France and Italy. Many of the drawings that I have a professor that comes in and talks about this every semester, did his, made his reputation on cave art in southern France, now does cave art in the southwestern United States. Jan Chimik, if anyone's come across that name, a professor at UT. Anyway, what the hell were they thinking? Well, we don't know what they're thinking. Well, should that matter to us? Why do we care what they think? They created something, we see it, we more or less appreciate it. Why do we care what they think? Well, there's another part of our brain, remember, it's not just all about art and perception, that's very interested in causes and consequences. How did he get, whatever frame of mind he was in, and who knows, what caused that? What's plausible? And there's 5 or 6 plausible ideas about why these Has anyone ever seen any of this cave art? Maybe traveling in the south of France, or they're like cathedrals. This isn't some, little hidey hole. This is Mammoth Cave. Enormous effort went into these over thousands of years by thousands of people. Amazing how they kept a consistent style. Anyway, so what were they thinking, and why do we care? Well, that's for anthropologists like Jimmy to think about. And he's got his hypotheses. Well, if I was them, this is what I would think. We do that all day long. It's a kind of filling in. What did he mean by that? He must have meant this. The other picture is by Chagall. I don't know if you can see the details. It's a little bit like, you see a guy in the lower right corner who's dreaming. Who had the great dream in the Old Testament?
Jacob.
This is Jacob's dream. And what he's seeing in his dream are angels going up and down the ladder. Up to heaven and back down from heaven. I could argue that if I wanted to, I could use this as an icon of downward thinking and upward thinking. Control from above, like stuff that's already recorded in your brain. Control from below, like things that come in through your senses. In fact, I'll probably end up doing that now that I thought of it.
So where do they meet? What part?
That's why I like awe. Because it meets all the time, every day. Waking, sleeping, it's always meeting. They're always working with each other, more or less. Different cognitive functions at night, late in the day, early in the day. Different people, of course. Different brain states, too much coffee, too much alcohol, not enough this, too much that. All kinds of things can tweak the neurochemistry of your brain, and therefore the relative proportions of how these cognitive functions are working. Some of them are accidental. My favorite one is all these guys that lost their libido, and they discovered that you can control your cholesterol by taking these drugs that will just, well, between my diet and this drug, no more cholesterol in my body. Every hormone, every steroid hormone we have, and that includes the sex steroids, are made out of cholesterol. So the trick is, and this is not a little trick, this is a big trick. It's so big that it was written on the forecourt at the great healing centers of Greece. You couldn't go in there, and they were bigger than, if you think the Mayo Clinic's big, these were bigger. And people didn't just come to them for obvious diseases of the body, all kinds of disorders. And there were hundreds and hundreds of priests in treatment. They didn't have exactly health care, but so there was some kind of a financial thing going on. But on the forecourt, before you got to speak to anybody, first thing you saw, nothing in excess. Nothing in excess. Aristotle built a whole book around nothing in excess. But this was done by the priests of Apollo long before Aristotle. So cholesterol is okay. Cholesterol is great, but not in excess. In fact, there's almost nothing that we can think of that isn't a little bit good sometimes, just not in excess. Excess for you might be different than excess for me. I'm a little weird in my reaction to caffeine. It kind of makes me sleepy. I'll have a latte for dinner and go to bed, not in the morning to wake me up. I've only met 3 or 4 other people that have that reaction. It turns out they were both hyperactive as infants, and I was too, so maybe there's a connection there. I don't have the time or resources to look into that, but it's got to be more than a coincidence. All right, what we got about art is that it is something the human brain does, and more about that. What brings art and science together? The most conspicuous feeling you have, like these things go on all day, we don't pay much attention to it, it's the business of life. Every now and again, There was a song in the 1960s, when the moon hits your eye like a big pizza pie, something dramatic happens. That's a more. Something dramatic happens and nothing's the same anymore. And that often accompanies awe, and something that goes along with awe in most cultural thinking about it is the word sublime. Sublime is awe, but it's combined with fear. So things that are truly awesome are also potentially dangerous. Someplace in your mind, whether it's a deity or something in nature, whether it's a great storm, the great sea, like this guy. This is one of the icons of Romanticism in the 19th century. This painting called Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog by Caspar David Friedrich. I think that's in the net. Get my museums mixed up these days. And the awesome strength that can destroy you. I thought when atomic energy was turned to solving human problems for not having to rely on fossil fuels, that was awesome. Now I can appreciate the dangers, keeping the balance. It probably is awesome if we can keep the balance. Nothing in excess. People get carried away. A word I use a lot, and it's a lovely word. I like it because I've always thought of the brain as a kind of something being orchestrated, with more or less conscious awareness. You kind of tell your brain what to do, okay? Up on the timpani, down on the piccolo, you know. Okay, pianissimo. And I like to think of the brain as a kind of a symphony. And I like the word resonance, because most instruments have the same notes, but slightly different aspects to them. We all have the same notes to a large extent, slightly different aspects, but it's incredibly hard to pin it down empirically. When something resonates with you, something that you may not fully understand is communicating with something within you that you don't fully understand, and yet you feel a connection. So resonance becomes a big deal. Pythagoras used to blow the minds of his followers by showing resonance. Not only did he do a lot of amazing early mathematics, but he demonstrated the mathematics of harmonics and strings. And his favorite demonstration was one, if my soprano friend was here, maybe she could make a crystal glass break. How the hell does that work? Well, what he would do is he would make a noise here, and over there, the string would vibrate. What's going on? He would try to explain it, but it was all mathematics, and nobody understood it, so they just considered him a magician.
You wanted a time check. I think the clock is wrong. They didn't reset it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've
It's
got about
6:30.
20-25 minutes left.
25 minutes. Okay, put on your roller skates.
Is that
folks.
right?
Yep.
I mean,
It's
okay.
6:30 and we're supposed
Put on
to
your roller skates.
go down to 7.
And I'm going to stop where I think it's really connected. Communication's the next really big deal. Okay, we got communications in the brain. Communications are facilitated by neurons. Neurotransmitters are important. We have a path that we can take from being too careful about your cholesterol to ruining your sex life, at least your libido. And Delacroix understood back in the 19th century, he had this great French romantic painter. That's his famous picture of liberty leading the people in the revolution. He did that in 1830. In 1850, he was writing his memoirs in his book, and he said that painting, that is to say, the material thing called painting, is no more than a pretext, the bridge between the mind of the painter and that of the spectator. So really, all I'm doing, folks, with you, is looking for bridges. Part of that, and here is the motivation for why people do art. Part of that is talking to myself. And there is a point where that's not good enough, so I need to talk back. The first artists want to know what they're thinking, who they are. If they have sufficient authority, personal authority and authenticity, that can be communicated to the audience. So we have crummy art and we have great art. We have people at all levels that appreciate both of them. It's the level of organization in people's minds with which they're communicating. So let's have a heart-to-heart conversation. Not just words to words. Abstraction. Big question got asked for me early on in graduate school. Actually, just before graduate school, I took a job and I was teaching Barnard students about art, and I would take them around to the museums. And this picture, Pavel Chelichu from the 30s, was about twice the size of that screen. And I would take my students, they were all sophomores for the most part at Barnard School of Economics, and we would look at that picture among others. And one year, we kept moving along. There was only about 7 or 8 of these students. We were moving along, and somebody said, "Where's Cynthia?" We lost Cynthia. People got a little panicky, and we backtracked, and she was standing in front of this painting crying. That was important for me, because my reflex was, she's crying. What's going on here? Why aren't I crying? Why aren't you crying? What is it that makes Cynthia cry? How different is she and in what way? There is a place where this painting is located, in Houston, where about 1/3 of the people that go into this place, called the Rothko Chapel, cry. I took my wife to the Metropolitan Museum of Art well, before she was my wife, our second date maybe. And she said, "Well, you're well interested in this deal, why don't you share it with me?" And we stood in front of a Rothko. We stood there for a minute. It's the Rothko with the panels of color. And she said, "So, I could do that." And I bit my tongue the second I said it, but I said, "Shut up." You don't say that on the second date. But she did. She was stunned, as I was too. Where did that come from? And she stood there, and then she grabbed my arm. She said, "I get it. I get it." Now, part of it is kind of knowing a little bit what to expect, that there's something there that you might get. This is why we go to museums. But you could get something any place. That's what the Transcendentalists taught us, Emerson, Thoreau. You could get a mud puddle. You could get the scum in the gutters, and it can be awesome if you look at it the right way, the right frame of mind. All right, abstraction. All art and science is abstract. What we have in our brains now, you and I, all of us, all organisms with brains, is an abstraction of the reality that's out there. First of all, we're limited by our senses. We are, in fact, the word is appropriate, we are biased by the fact that we can't see ultraviolet. Maybe 1 out of 1,000 of us can see a little ultraviolet. Well, there's species all over the place that can see ultraviolet, because in their ancestral history, that was important to their survival. It meant a biological need. A bunch of them can see ultraviolet, they're going to have the babies. They're going to have the descendants. So in a way, abstract should not be such a scary word. Abstract art got a lot of attention because it was so unusual and unexpected. But it was doing what Mark Rothko said in some of his later thinking about after he made his career as a preeminent abstract expressionist, that the abstractionists of our age, that were being criticized all over the place, are also our objectivists. And they use appearances for the purposes of demonstrating the reality of the world of ideas. A little more sophisticated than seeing, a red block is to see an idea. But we're humans, we're capable of doing that. skipping, we want to, my belief is that great art emerges from, great art, emerges from and penetrates to the deepest levels of consciousness. I know some artists personally that have been there, and they can't get back. Is science different than art? Not according to Huxley, the guy that defended Darwin in Darwin's day when he was still having to defend the theory of evolution. And Einstein is a refinement of everyday thinking. It's a selective attention to things. It's a selective balance of these cognitive functions. More about ethology next time we have another hour. Well, I should say that it really, all I need to say is that these domains were pretty separate from each other. Developmental biologists barely talk to ecologists. I was at one end of the hall at the Walters Life Science Building, and the developmental biologists were at the other end, and we met maybe for a cup of coffee, but we didn't know what each other were talking about when we were excited about our research. That's changed. That's changed. Evolutionary biology, physiology, all talking to each other now. And the big, giant findings in, most conspicuously to us as human health, have to do with the physiology of behavior. Okay, so we're talking about deep dives. The point is, all things are more or less connected. Okay, and this is good. We're going to go back ancient spiritual traditions if you want to. Everything is hooked up to everything else in the universe. Problem is, the path from one to another is sometimes kind of circuitous. Keep following it, you can do it. There's a way to keep following it. Let's skip the needs that we have. And figure, the way to do it is to, and we'll see in a minute, to describe what you don't understand. That's something artists understood right away, and it's a natural instinct. We're talking about cognitive functions being balanced differently. Artists want to describe right away. Scientists tend to want to take things apart right away. So like, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. How do you get to understand something? Describe, describe, describe. And then it's like looking at the Rothko. Something happens. You look for somebody's arm to grab, and you want to say, I got it. What do you got? I can't explain it, but I got it. Very, very frustrating. These people could become our poets and our artists, but they get it. All meaning derives from connections. You want to take that to the limit? The meaning of life depends on connections. This got my attention in the 60s. One of those things that was in the back of my head for 30 years, it popped up again when I was thinking about, yeah, I understand, but I don't know how to tell you about it. It's a line from a song by the incredible string band, a big deal in the mid-60s. You know all the words, you sing all the notes, but you never quite learn the song. I can tell by the sadness in your eyes, you never quite learned that song. So connections are sought within people. There's a breakout diagram of the brain. Among participants, there's you and me. Part in the middle is what we have in common. And between participants and the contents of mind, all of us. How much time? 5 minutes?
10,
That's
12.
So let's do 5 more minutes
12
and
minutes?
then try to open it up for questions.
Okay, well, we had a lot of questions, and I like that, but I'm going to ask you now to go beyond the traditional mind map, which is really a very fancy flowchart of how things are connected to each other, and adapt that. One of my good buddies at Tennessee was, or 2 of them in the psych department were psychoanalysts. We like to talk about that a lot. I had that in college, back at Drew University in New Jersey. I had courses in psychoanalysis, but never really implemented it fully. I was interested in Rorschach tests. The same thing can mean different things to different people, and it's a possible diagnostic. Al Burstein's a professor emeritus, still here in Knoxville, who is one of the world's experts on Rorschach tests, but I'm going to ask people to do something like a Rorschach test. I'm going to ask you to do something like that. And I've asked hundreds of people over the years to just put the word art in the middle of your page and do a free association to what that brings to mind next. That's a couple dozen pens.
I just got it back there.
And then, all right, let's say art was like stone, and the next thing you put down is white. Put that white, what does that bring to mind? What does that bring to mind? What does that bring to mind? Follow that out in the chain until it gets a little inconvenient. Then go back to art and start again with another chain. Another string of ideas. If I was a psychoanalyst and we were doing that test, I'd keep saying, faster, faster. Don't think about it. Tell me, don't think about it. Be spontaneous. Spontaneity is authenticity. Every professional interrogator knows that. I say the first person to finish or raise their hand, that might take a few hours. Let's give it another minute and be authentic. These are absolutely privileged. I will not, none of this will ever be, go beyond my eyes.
Display, or display these.
No, I'm not gonna. They might become part of a giant anonymous data set. Not likely. Well, that's plenty, I think. We can't fully enjoy, in fact, we can't enjoy at all the fruit of this. The fruit of this is when I do this in class, or I've done it in, I did it at a seminar at Pasteur University one time. I had 120 nurses I had collate. We all did something like this. And what the payback is to see how much of what art means to you, that's your definition of art, not the dictionaries, yours, how much that means to you overlaps with most other people. Sometimes it's extraordinarily different. It's almost always overlapping a certain percentage, and then we go out further and further out from the core idea of art, and we get into all kinds of, sometimes very intimate and personal things that aren't obviously connected to art in any way. And yet, it's your definition. And you use the word art. That's what it means to you. So if you can just leave these things when you leave today, I'm going to enjoy that, and I will collate them. I'll share them with you. Show them. Okay. The idea that everything's connected to everything else, and that the meaning of the life has to do with connections. Beliefs, they're not the same thing as logical conclusions, energize both artists and scientists. Not the logic so much, but the beliefs they have. And when I first read Leaves of Grass, I read it in college and didn't pay attention. I read it in graduate school and noticed this word, this phrase, all truths waiting in all things. And it clicked for me because a couple of hours before that we were talking about the transcendentalists in New England philosophy. Theodore Roethke, the contemporary poet, relatively contemporary, said, all finite things reveal infinitude. These were beliefs, not logical conclusions. And yet they resonate across every field of endeavor, every field where people work hard to describe and understand what they're talking about. We spend a half an hour learning enough about calligraphy so those people, Japanese style inkbrush writing, so those people that might be interested, and it's usually about 1 out of 5, will follow through with it. And the calligraphy of words in Japanese and Chinese as well is followed by the word do. So writing do. Do means, in Japanese, aesthetic philosophy, to understand the universal by studying the particular. A whole huge school for 100 years of thousands of artists and calligraphers and poets, same belief.
Reductionism in science.
You can reduce, but when you describe, you get that, you're looking for somebody's arm to hold. Something happens when you describe.
I have a question.
What are our first connections? The first connections we have that are on our organism level of organization, not our brains. We've eaten food, we've had some more or less tea, we can even smell each other. You can see the color in this room, stuff's converging to affect who we are at the moment. But at the organism level, we are each the outcome of an unbroken line from the earliest organisms that ever existed. That's the hypothesis of almost all practicing scientists, that there is an unbroken line of descent. All their struggles, all their trials, and just look at critters today in the wild, in the zoo, in your backyard, they're all struggling. All their pleasures, all their pains, everything is summarized in you. In you.
In utero.
In utero, in you.
I mean, there's a lot of, I don't know that it could be called cognition, but there's a lot of sensory input to the embryos.
Oh, yes, for sure. Sure. And as parts of the nervous system start to differentiate and become different, so that remains part of each part's legacy. Con?
Well, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I was thinking a moment ago about the difference or the similarities in art and science in this discussion. And thinking back about the quote about art, basically that all this information passes through us and then passes out of us.
Mm-hmm.
I would look at a piece of art as the importance or the relevance, the significance of the art is not what was passing in, but the transformation or what was brought out. So if you're, even for realistic art, realism, some might say, oh, well, you captured that art perfectly or that portrait perfectly, but really it's what did the human being put into what came out of the human being. That what I would say would be the value or the relevance of the art.
Artists are the supreme magicians. I like that this guy talked about magic at the beginning. They know what pushes your buttons. Not necessarily, they haven't made a study of it. Leonardo da Vinci made a study of it. He knew about peripheral vision, and he put his scientific knowledge in the service of Mona Lisa. He really did. Most artists have an intuition, figure it out gradually over time, or just have that cognitive function to be able to detect that more carefully. They know that the secret's in the eyes, the secret's in the corner of the mouth, the secret's here, the secret's there. Maybe they know all the secrets. They're pushing their buttons, consciously or unconsciously, and it's resonating within themselves, and hopefully it resonates within you. The more authentic they are, the more you're going to appreciate it if you look deeply.
So art and science. Art is basically that magic, but when you're talking about this topic in terms of science, it seems to me that the goal of science is to take the human out of the equation. You want to describe actually what's there, its function, you're reducing it down, and
making it very mechanistic.
Introducing a human into the equation is confusing the empirical data that's,
Well, this
I'd
was,
like to hear a different.
this was the
different
big fight of
viewpoint.
the 1960s between traditional psychology, which believed that absolutely, and ethology. And ethology made some major findings that explained things that were inexplicable by traditional psychology. And they just got ignored, like, oh, well, it's not important. Or, oh, yeah, those animals live out in the woods, who cares? The ones in the cage are controlled. No possibilities for screw-ups, very careful. Yes, they are controlled. Yeah, we know exactly how to control all kinds of things in caged animals. What does that mean for animals that aren't caged? That's another problem.
Well, I would say the cages there is part of the output of the human where we've corrupted the actual.
We're trying to
natural
support our own mechanistic biases,
Yeah,
I think, by
Yeah.
doing that. As soon as the breakthrough came, looking at real animals in the real world, naturalists did that. It got bootstrapped because a famous physician did it, Conrad Lorenz. He was a doctor, you don't argue with doctors, right? And he started understanding about how geese and ducks had experiences that couldn't be explained by traditional psychology, and started developing that. His students, Tim Bergen, and a few others started picking up on Conrad Lorenz's work. That's an interesting story how that made a breakthrough. But
Imprinting.
imprinting is critical, that happens before you're born. So, I talked about this. I said something like this, as romantic and flowery as I could make it, about we are each the outcome of an unbroken line of descent. And a lot of students were affected. I had one student 5 years ago that jumped up and down. They just came from an English class with Alan Dunn, and they were reading Thomas Wolfe, and they had just talked about this phrase, and he didn't think mine made sense without this. Each of us is the sons he has not counted. Subtract us into nakedness of night, and you shall see begin in Crete 4,000 years ago a love that ended yesterday in Texas. Each moment is the fruit of 40,000 years. The minute, the minute winning days, like flies buzz home to death, and every moment is a window on all time. So I think McCormick Angel basically bores me, but there are things like that that pop up that are wow. And with me, at least, having had the experience with the biology and all, it resonates. It's like a gong goes off. It's like Pythagoras hit this string over here, you know, and that string over there started vibrating. How does that work? I don't know how that works. We have a lot of theories and some examples, but that's about as far as it gets. So, the ethological attitude, we won't go into it. But whenever you're trying to make progress, any kind of progress, anything, and this was actually my former student that's now working in the circus said this was a critical memory for him. Describe, describe, describe. Sitting in front of a blank canvas, you did something really great last year, everybody's expecting you to do something great again, you don't know what to put down. Describe, describe, describe. Don't worry about it yet. Trust that when enough of this comes together, it's going to transcend itself. The rest is just cleaning it up. The real, not the ideal. Biggest breakthrough in art. The art students jumped up and down. Wait a minute, we just learned about the Romantics and how much trouble these guys got into. We learned about Corot making pictures of people planting stuff out in the garden. They weren't idealized the way human beings should be. They were the way human beings were. You could almost smell them, watching them work hard in the garden or out in the fields. Didn't do that before that. The great rewards in art were for idealizing people. This is what you should be like. This should versus is business is one of the most mischievous concepts, I think, in Western culture. And I'm going to stop with mischief. That's the minute question. It's is it 7 o'clock?
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I apologize, but we'll see how this goes.
No, you're okay.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Did anybody have a question to ask?
Some more, yeah.
In your opinion, is art only able to be created by humans then, and not in any other organism?
Great question. There's a bunch of species that do things that don't make any sense. You know about bowerbirds? They collect blue stuff,
Mm.
bright blue stuff. Whoever has the most blue stuff is the one that's gonna get lucky that day. I was just wandering around, okay, guys, who's got it, who's not? Wow, look at all that blue stuff. Is that art? Well, frankly, I met 2 or 3 artists that said, why did they start taking art? Why did they go to art school? Well, I wanted to get a date. You know, art's sexy. Most of them got past that, and they think that, you know, they're embarrassed by that now. But it's all over the place all the time. It doesn't matter how you get started. But yes, there are organisms that do things that look like art. What's going on in their mind? Great question, and that's why I have a whole couple of hours on Paleolithic art. 30,000 years ago, what's going on in their mind? I have 3 or 4 good friends that are successful artists. I don't know what's going on in their minds. They don't know what's going on in their minds. So how much does it matter? It's best to call art something that resides within a human being. And I don't mean a cognitive function, just that. What they produce, these things around us are artifacts. They are the byproducts of a process. The process is the functioning of all of these cognitive functions in a creative way. The byproduct is an artifact. I was in the middle of almost a mean-spirited quarrel between graduate school and NIH. I spent a year at Harvard, and I was in the middle of a quarrel between the director, one of the serious curators of the Anthropology Museum, which is very important at Harvard, and the Art Museum. And they had a new piece that was brought in by a collector. And I wanted for the Anthropology Museum. No, I wanted for the Art Museum. Anthropology, art, anthropology, art. And this got to be mean after a while. You know, and I just watched this like a tennis game, you know, fly on the wall among these distinguished curators. It ended up in the Anthropology Museum, but they promised to display it as though it was a work of art. So they put it on a pillar with a light on it. They didn't put it in a case with 100 other masks. So it was an artifact, a work of art, a byproduct of art, which we always have within us.
Right, it's an experience that you have resonate with you. Then what level of cognition do you need in order to experience that resonance, like someone
need them
who's
all.
produced? Yeah.
That's why I keep mentioning authenticity. And in these things, maybe you did, maybe you didn't, you didn't have a lot of time, I didn't drill on it much. You could go deep into your subconscious mind about what art means to you. Like the stuff I was forced to do when I was 7 years old. Or you know, how much trouble I got in the first time I discovered finger paints. And something like that, deep, maybe subconscious. It's my great pleasure every now and again in class for people to think of things that they haven't thought of in many years. And to bring it to the surface and to make it part of the picture. I'm not there to analyze anybody. This is not a clinical thing.
Or your research, like what part of the brain, like if it were damaged, you would not be able to, you know, appreciate any art anymore.
I use the words from aphasia, productive aphasia, and where you're making something. Some people can't make language, but they can understand it. Some people can make language all day long and not understand anything. There are matters of degree of damage to the balance between the activity in 2 parts of the left hemisphere, the Broca's area and the Wernicke's area, near the boundary of the parietal cortex. Those 2 areas have more or less damage in a stroke. So we can look at people that have more or less damage. And for the first time in history, in the last 10 years, we've been able to look at how much damage there is without waiting for an autopsy. And how active they are. We can watch your brain in motion. It's like watching videos of an athlete so they can perfect their performance. We can watch sugar being taken up by neurons, or presuming that they're more active because of that, we can watch that in real time. It costs tens of thousands of dollars, so it's expensive research, but it's getting cheaper and cheaper and easier, and soon we'll know everything there is to know about nothing.
Unfortunately, our time is. So this will be our last meeting for the year. Our next confirmed meeting is February 15th, so the day after Valentine's Day. And the topic is bird courtship. And that'll be over at Iams Nature Center. And then I hope we'll be back over here April the 14th for a topic called Helping People Help the Land. There's a branch within the USDA called the NRCS, and they work with people who own land to try to implement environmental saving and conservation efforts from private landowners. So that'll hopefully be here April the 14th. And we thank everybody for coming. Don't forget to grab a bumper sticker and a brochure about us, and we'll hope everyone has a happy Thanksgiving.
Let me tell you that there's nothing here that's not on the website, neilgreenberg.com. And there's like 80 lectures. I do on the website what I do here. I just describe. Just run off and follow it where it goes. Each one's will have its own little mind now. But anyway, it's all there also. And that's what class uses when we select from that for our classes.
I downloaded the picture of the cave art. It looks like somebody preparing Thanksgiving dinner to me. Those big turkeys they were hunting.